My name is Alexis Kinlan, and I'll be the host of today's webinar. The School for Public Policy at the University of Calgary is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical research and for bringing people together to discuss the important issues with experts, which is what we are here to do today. Thank you for joining us. If you have to leave early, we post recordings of all our webinars on our website and YouTube channel, and you'll receive a link in the following email. The topic of today's webinar is Canada's food security during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our speaker today is Dr. Kerry Holland. For our format, our speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for an audience Q&A. Please type your questions in the Q&A button below, and we will pose them to your speaker. I'd like now to turn this presentation over to Dr. Kerry Holland.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to just extend a thank you to the School of Public Policy and to the Simpson Center for facilitating this webinar today. And thank you to all those tuning in who haven't expressed an interest in this policy topic. My intention with this presentation today is to outline some of the research of a paper that was recently published this week from the Simpson Center, and then try and leave as much time at the end for questions. So agriculture in Canada is defined as an essential service, but it often doesn't get the public attention that it deserves. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed that. There was media stories of empty store shelves and supply chain disruptions that really have drawn consumer attention to issues of food security. And perhaps for the first time, consumers became very aware of the food system that they often take for granted. So in provoking discussions about food security, it really rested on two main things, and that was affordability and access. Canadians wanted to better understand if food security in Canada was stable and secure. So in terms of food prices, we've really only seen very minimal increases so far, between 4 and 6%, which was what had been forecasted at the end of last year for the year of 2020. So in terms of food increases or price increases, it's possibly reasonable to expect that there will be slight increases going forward. And of course, that is dependent on what is happening internationally, how our Canadian dollar is fluctuating, how an oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia would impact our food prices. And then, of course, what's going on domestically with our retail and our processing facilities. All of those can, of course, affect the prices of our food. But food prices are not the only determinant of affordability for Canadians. And it's an issue really inherently linked to income insecurity. And of course, this pandemic has brought about a lot of economic impact and financial hardship for many Canadians as jobs have been lost, and there's been reduced hours for many workers. As well, many businesses have been forced to close. And with that huge financial hardship, of course, we can expect that trends of food insecurity will continue to grow among Canadians, because the economic impact that we're feeling right now from this pandemic is expected to be longer term than the immediate health crisis. Now, in terms of access, the Canadian food supply remains stable, and consumers can be confident that our food system is holding up very well. Canada is a net exporter of food, with the exception of produce, but we also are the 5th largest importer of ag products and food products in the world, which means that this integrated food system ensures a continuous supply for Canadian grocery stores. So any shortages so far have been very temporary, and we as consumers can be confident that our grocery store shelves will continue having supply. But that doesn't mean, even though the Canadian food system has shown amazing resiliency, it has also shown some vulnerabilities, and it hasn't been impermeable to the risk and the effects of the crisis. And there have been 3 key disruptions that I identify in my paper that Canadians have seen so far. And the first being that with any crisis comes a great deal of uncertainty. And that has caused a major shift in consumer trends, shopping trends. We see media stories of consumers hoarding products, empty store shelves, and that of course causes concern and more panic buying. And so researchers have identified that that is the main reason why there have been shortages so far, is because of consumer trends. Now, the second major disruption is really linked to changes in consumption patterns. So as Canadian restaurants were forced to close and schools were closed, there was major shifts in consumption and demand. And that had a lot of farmers quickly trying to adapt to those changing demands. And so of course we see in the media stories of dairy farmers dumping milk, or mushroom farmers destroying produce crops. And of course that leads to a lot of confusion among consumers as well. But shifts in production and packaging, for example, are not easily changed, and there's very limited storage capacity, especially for perishables. For many consumers, it's really been an eye-opener in terms of how many parts of our food system work on what's considered this just-in-time production. And in the months ahead, it'll be interesting to see how primary agriculture and also our processing sectors adapt, as many groups have indicated that it's easier to scale back production than scale up production quickly. And that'll be interesting to see how that is affecting the food supply, and also how it's affecting our primary sectors. Now, the third major disruption, which has gained a lot of public attention, has been the closure of meat processing facilities and the reduced processing capacity at others. And it's because our meat processing facilities have really shown a susceptibility to the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And that's mostly because of the close working conditions at those facilities. Of course, because meat processing in Canada is very concentrated. For example, in Alberta, 2 packing plants are responsible for over 70% of Canadian beef. Of course, when we hear stories of those facilities having to close or reduce processing capacity, consumers became worried that there would be shortages, and then also how affordable meat would be if there was such a huge spike in demand. But we've seen that our meat processors have tried to quickly adapt, that closures have only been temporary. And we also see that they're trying to quickly put into place better protective measures for their workers to try and prevent further spread going forward, and of course, try and increase their capacity. So I think for now, it's safe to say that food insecurity in Canada is more related to income insecurity than it will have to do with supply chain issues. Food insecurity, as it is linked to income insecurity, is a very complex policy topic worthy of more research and definitely more attention by policymakers. The fact that over 5 million Canadians are deemed food insecure is something that our policymakers should be paying more attention to. But it was somewhat beyond the scope of this particular research paper. What I really wanted to focus my attention on for this paper was how these disruptions in the supply chains were really affecting primary agriculture, and how their ability to manage this crisis would impact food security going forward. So Canada's food system from farm to table is really an interconnected web of many factors. And at the very foundation of that food system is primary producers. Now, to fully appreciate the financial impact that this pandemic has on our Canadian farmers, we need to really examine it within the context of what was going on in Canadian agriculture prior to the pandemic. And if we look at the last year alone, Canadian farmers have been struggling with volatile international markets, mostly attributed to geopolitical issues. We had the 2019 harvest that was so affected by weather conditions, often referred to as the harvest from hell. And we also see major disruptions in terms of transport and shipping. The CN rail strike last fall and the illegal rail blockades earlier this year leading up to the pandemic caused huge economic losses for our farmers. So if you examine it within that context, this pandemic further puts more pressure on our farmers, and of course, how they're able to manage this crisis will determine a lot of farm operations viability in the years ahead. So net farm incomes have been declining in Canada. And last week, there was new numbers that came out that Canadian farm debt has now reached a record high of $115 billion. So in that context, if we look at the various sectors and how they've been impacted by this crisis, we see that produce and livestock farmers have arguably been the hardest hit so far. And that's because of these supply chain disruptions. But grain and oilseed and pulse producers are very anxious right now. I think there's a lot of concern about how international markets will be affected as other countries adapt and what their consumption patterns will be. I think that the farm groups have really effectively vocalized that Canadian farmers need aid, and quickly. They need programming assistance, not just to try and see them through this pandemic, but also to ensure Canadians' long-term food security. So the policy response of the federal government so far has really been inadequate. And farm groups have voiced their disappointment with the announcement so far, and farmers are clearly voicing their frustration right now as well. And they continue to call on government to step up and do more. So what we've seen from the government is a lot of announcements of old money, and they've tried to announce it as if it's new money. And that's been frustrating for a lot of farmers who are incurring huge losses. So the Trudeau government, of course, has faced some serious criticisms from Canadians and Canadian farmers in particular in recent years for their actions, but also their inaction. And I would argue that the federal government really, if it wants to demonstrate its commitment to agriculture and to farmers, there are a few key actions that they could take right now that I think would demonstrate that commitment. So the first that I suggest in my paper is to try and develop this emergency ag fund. And the CFA has put forth this proposal of $2.6 billion, but it basically is highlighting what the sectors are telling them that losses have been incurred so far. And I think that any emergency ag fund that would be announced should be more in proportion to the losses that farmers have incurred so far during this pandemic. For instance, pork and beef producers have lost over $1 billion because of supply chain disruption. And I think developing an emergency ag fund is also important because it's beyond the existing business risk management programs that clearly aren't working for a lot of Canadian farmers. The second suggestion that I have for policy action from government is because Canadian farmers are so reliant on export markets, we need to ensure that borders remain open to agricultural products, that we fight against any protectionist measures of other countries. For instance, a few days ago, the US government made mention that they were considering banning international beef. And of course, that would have a huge impact on Canadian beef farmers. So we need to make sure that we're really vocalizing that borders need to stay open, that obviously it's a two-way street when it comes to us and the US in terms of ag trade. So we need our federal leaders to really step up and make sure that barriers aren't imposed. As well, some researchers have suggested that because Canadian ag production is so stable and we can produce huge commodity levels for export market, that stability creates what's called like a soft power. So not only can we try and build on new market potential, as some countries around the world right now are trying to find new suppliers for ag commodities because they want that stability of quality products, but we can also use that soft power to try and resolve some of the geopolitical disputes that we have right now. And I think that would be a critical first step. The tariffs on Canadian pulses for India, the ban on Canadian canola, for instance, with China. These are all things that our policymakers really need to try and take more action on. Now, The third policy action that I suggest in the paper is more of kind of a long-term vision for agriculture and trying to develop a national agriculture strategy. So with any crisis comes unprecedented challenges, but it can also teach us some valuable lessons. And we've seen some vulnerabilities in our food system. And so going forward, there needs to be a dialogue about how do we make our food system more resilient, and how do we ensure that the foundation, the primary agriculture sectors, as the foundation of our food system, remain sustainable long term. Does that mean diversifying into new markets, trying to produce new commodities here in Canada to keep up with global consumer trends of more plant-based proteins? As well, there needs to be an overhaul of existing business risk management programs so that we can take proactive measures, that if we're faced with another major crisis, which undoubtedly we will be in the future, how can we make those programs more supportive and responsive to Canadian farmers to ensure their viability? And I think another main issue for Canadian agriculture prior to this pandemic, but also going forward, will be trying to attract a workforce into not only the primary sectors, but the processing sectors as well. And one of the highlights from many government reports in recent years has been that Canada has this huge potential for increasing our value-added industry, and that translating into higher value exports. And I think that by really investing in value-added industry, we can accelerate our economic benefits, create domestic markets for our producers, and these government reports basically argue that by doing so, we're stabilizing our food security long term. But in terms of that, we need to look at what's going to facilitate value-added industry and what some of the challenges with that will be. And one of that is labor force, but also looking at the regulatory framework in Canada and trying to better understand if it's impeding innovation or what else government can actually be doing. So Canadian agriculture employs over 2.3 million Canadians, and it generates billions of dollars towards our GDP. So not only is the stability of our ag industry important in terms of food security, but also it's vitally important economically, and it can serve an important role in Canada's economic recovery. So I think in the short term, we have to be reactive and try and get our Canadian producers and our processing facilities through this pandemic, but we also need to start looking long term about what we want Canadian agriculture to be and trying to find ways that we can capitalize on that potential. And with that, I will start taking questions.
Thank you so much for that paper, Dr. Holland. There's a lot to discuss, and we already have some questions in the queue for you. So I'm going to put two of them together because I noticed they're kind of similar. So there was two questions about temporary foreign workers, which is, a topic that many people are interested in, I know. So the first question is, what impact are changes to the temporary foreign worker programs going to have on food security? And then the other question, which I'm going to group with it as well, is, do we have enough temporary foreign workers to sustain our farms?
So at the beginning of this pandemic, when borders closed to international travel, of course, a lot of produce farmers in particular were extremely concerned because, of course, that lack of labor force would affect not only their seeding, but long-term affect their harvest as well. And we've seen the federal government step up in that way. They provided an exemption to temporary foreign workers, and they also provided $1,500 per worker for a 2-week mandatory quarantine period. So produce farmers were very thankful of that government initiative. The Temporary Foreign Workers Program, and again, this has been another ongoing issue being discussed in government for years, In fact, last year, the Senate Committee on Agriculture put out this great report, and they identified that there needs to be changes to the temporary foreign workers program. And they suggested that in order to increase that labor force and attract more foreign workers, we can look at things such as kind of fast tracking their way to immigrate to Canada permanently, becoming permanent residents, offering them better benefits, and as well also giving them credit for past years that they have worked in Canada, and trying to ease the application process. We have really seen the dependence of many of our sectors on temporary foreign workers during this pandemic. I think consumers have really become more aware of how dependent some of our sectors are on that labor. As it has been so challenging for so many sectors, not only produce sectors, but also our processing facilities, to try and get enough labor force. Canadian agriculture processing facilities have some of the highest vacancy rates in labor force. And so it remains a challenge to try and attract more labor into those facilities. And of course, I think we're going to still depend on foreign workers. So I guess that's a very long way of saying that, yes, we need to keep attracting foreign workers, and possibly trying to see what better ways we can facilitate that stability of keeping them here, or fast tracking their immigration process.
Yeah. So we have a question here where someone says they were kind of struck by the comment about that that Canada is the 5th largest importer of food. So this person wants to know, is that not a major impact on food security for Canadians? Are there studies? Is there any clarity on the factors that supposedly make it economic to import processed foods? Like if we're importing frozen pizza from Germany and frozen spinach from France and frozen broccoli and frozen, raisins from South Africa. So what are some of the, what is the impact of importing foods for Canadians, or impact on our food security, I guess?
So currently, as it stands right now, Canada is the 5th largest exporter of agricultural goods in the world. We're the 5th largest importer. So as I mentioned in the presentation, that integrated food system really does allow for this continuous supply of products in our grocery stores. So that does actually help our food security in terms of supply. And there's been some interesting dialogue started in recent weeks amongst consumers and media that Canada should possibly be producing more of what we need. So this idea of food sovereignty, which isn't necessarily a bad idea, that Canada should maybe be looking at other commodities that we could produce here instead of relying so much on other imports from other countries. Of course, if there are those border disruptions, trade disruptions, that will affect our food security. But currently, as it stands, I think that integrated food system really does support food security in Canada. Going forward, I think that there's a lot of potential to grow our exports in terms of value. So if we were to be finishing our products here more and exporting finished goods internationally, that increases our revenue for our nation. But a couple of years ago, the federal government gave this challenge to the ag industry, that they wanted our exports to reach $75 billion. But they never gave much of an action plan in order to meet those goals, and really haven't given the support to the industry that it needs in order to reach that. But that potential has been identified by government for years. But of course, there's barriers to that as well. Like I mentioned, getting enough labor and looking at our regulatory system and seeing, is Canada a business-friendly environment? Should we be producing plant-based burgers here by a Canadian company? Or what can we do to attract more protein fractionation plants on the prairies? I know that's been one issue discussed around the Edmonton area, is that we produce so many pulses here, but this idea of maybe trying to capitalize on super clusters and trying to put more value into our products here, so we're not exporting so much raw commodity.
So someone has this question, like also in your paper, you talked a lot about the federal government, and then, I think there's a little bit about the provinces as well. So one question here are, what are some of the things that the provincial government can do for food security? And what are things that, like, versus the federal government? Like, how much can the provinces take on?
So as I'm sure many tuning in today well know, that agriculture in Canada is a joint jurisdiction between the federal and provincial governments. The provinces, of course, have much more limited fiscal capacity. And I think the provinces have been strong voices on behalf of their producers. But the provinces have also really dragged their feet in recent years when it comes to reforming business risk management programs, for example, and providing that stability to their producers. Again, it reflects many provinces' fiscal capacity and trying to figure out better ways of supporting their producers. But I think provinces themselves can look at whether or not they're creating a business-friendly environment for value-added industry to start up in their provinces. But I think the federal government really needs to take the lead on this. The provinces, of course, can be very strong voices, but the federal government really needs to take the lead on this, I think.
Okay, so we have one question here, which is, I guess, this person would like to know more about food security in general. So their concern is that food security equals craft dinner and heavily processed food. Is there a definition that distinguishes fresh or flash frozen foods and foods full of preservatives? So I think it's just a question about, kind of about understanding food security.
So in the paper, I do present like the official definition of food security by the FAO. And I mean, the United Nations puts out that not only is food security related to affordability and access, but also that it's healthy, that's culturally appropriate, and that the majority of people can access food in a timely and affordable fashion. But that being said, right, even before this pandemic, it was estimated that 4.5 million Canadians are living food insecure, meaning that they cannot afford or access sufficient amounts of healthy and nutritious food. So as I mentioned in the presentation, that's something that deserves attention by policymakers. And as I see the economic impact of this pandemic lasting, months, if not years, there's going to be more Canadians that are impacted financially. And of course, that affects their ability to afford healthy and nutritious foods.
So one of the questions we have here is, how do we transform the ideas presented in the paper into reality? So what are some of the next steps?
That's been a challenge that, as someone who has researched ag policy for years, I think I struggle with, is that I see really great ideas being put forth by ag groups. I mean, they're the best ones to really speak to how their sectors and their farmers are doing and try and have that grassroots information coming up to policymakers. And policymakers, for the most part, have listened. But when it comes to action steps, that's been a struggle. And really, if we look at ag policy, not just with the Trudeau government, but the government before, or all governments, action really depends on political will. And I think in terms of, lots of people say, oh, it's because the Trudeau government is so urban centric, that they don't have representation in the West, for example, that they're not really concerned about Canadian farmers. But on the flip side, I think that the Canadian ag groups have been very vocal and provided really valuable information to government that, look, here's this enormous economic potential of this industry, but it needs stability. We need to be supporting our farmers more, and we need to look at facilitating, value-added processing, if that would help stabilize our primary sectors, but also translate into huge economic benefits. And I mean, after this pandemic, Canada is going to be on the road to economic recovery, hopefully. And if we look at the various sectors that have been impacted, whether it be airlines or the automotive industry, and et cetera, we see that Canadian agriculture, usually through any crisis, is the backbone of our economy. And I think we need to start recognizing the potential that it could have. And then also looking at all the various economic and social and environmental rules of the industry, and looking at, okay, yes, this is the strategy of our government, these are our long-term goals, but what are action steps in order to get there? And I think an important part of that is really consulting with the various sectors and actually heeding their advice, because they're the best ones to be able to translate that information to policymakers. But I think one of the silver linings that I take from this crisis, if there's any to be taken, is that with this consumer attention on our food system, and there's been a lot of confusion, a lot of misconceptions about the food system and our supply chains, but that public attention will also help translate to policy action, because governments look at where public opinion is, and hopefully that will push agriculture onto the policy agenda of the federal and provincial governments, and hopefully they'll be responsive to that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great answer. So in light of the piecemeal approach from government so far to assist agriculture weathering the storm during COVID-19, do we need to rethink our whole framework for federal, provincial, territorial agricultural partnerships? Which two issues would be most important to focus on rethinking first?
Well, that's kind of like two separate questions. Sorry, I'm trying to break it down. In terms of the response of our federal government so far, like I said, a lot of the money that they've been announcing has been existing money. They've been trying to announce it and disguise it as new funding, but it really isn't, which is frustrating to a lot of farmers, and rightfully so, especially given the huge costs that farmers have incurred so far. But I think that the federal government, as they start, announcing additional programs, if they intend to do so, I think that while they should take the lead, the provinces can be a strong voice for what their producers in their province and how the impact is affecting them. But like I said, I think the federal government needs to take the lead. If I was going to look at two areas that I think really could use improvement, I think the first one is business risk management programs. They're extremely flawed as they currently stand. And even in like the last 3 years, the CFA and its provincial affiliates have been extremely vocal about agri-stability, for example, not working. In fact, only about 30% of Canadian farmers buy into ag stability each year. And even this year alone, in March, there was a parliamentary standing committee that heard from a number of presenters that said, like, accountants said, it's not working for farmers, it's too costly, it's too complicated. And a lot of ag industry groups saying, it's not going to help farmers. So I think that we really need to look at what's working, what's not, ways that can be improved. And I think the provinces, of course, with their limited fiscal capacity, but they're still responsible for 40% of that programming funding, they have a huge role to play too. But the federal government needs to look possibly at helping the provinces more, especially during this pandemic, because the fiscal pressures on them right now are extraordinary. And in terms of maybe a second issue is just trying to see how we can better facilitate investment into provinces, whether that means trying to invest more in these superclusters, trying to take advantage of the amazing research and technology that's going on at some of our prairie universities, for example. We need government to really step in and try and build those bridges between researchers at universities and try and facilitate more value-added industry and investment, and connecting that with local producers as well.
So another question here is someone has a comment. They say, pleased to hear you mention the need to improve regulatory framework, I think, in Canada. But they would like to ask if you also feel that applying innovation technologies such as fast tracking, gene editing guidelines would or could help Canadian farmers competitively.
Well, that's definitely one of the issues that's gained a lot of attention in farm media lately, is this gene editing. Consumers have been very vocal about genetically modified organisms. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in urban media about what GMOs are. I think the farm media has done an excellent job in trying to dispel some of the myths and trying to present a very fair perspective on what GMOs are and how our food has been engineered for decades. Going forward, I think there needs to be more education for consumers, but also, again, looking at our regulatory framework, like how can we better facilitate innovation? And again, that brings in our universities as well, and trying to promote agriculture as really this whole system concept, from primary agriculture producers, of course, right, to processing facilities, but also looking at how can we better enable research and technology to be implemented and to give Canada that competitive edge. And I mean, we're competing against our US neighbors all the time for markets and competing against some of the subsidies that they give their farmers. But I mean, there's huge potential in Canada for making those investments. And that's how it should really be regarded, as an investment.
So we have a question here, I think, from a farmer.
Excellent.
So, yeah, I think there's a couple farmer questions.
My dad?
I don't think it's your dad.
Okay.
Food security hinges on farmers staying in business. Stabilizing our industry is priority number one. Agricultural producers are continually in survival mode. How do we add value to our industry, and how can we move from price takers to price setters?
It's very difficult because, of course, because so many of our sectors are export dependent, we're basically at the mercy of what's going on internationally. So even in terms of this pandemic, how other countries around the world are adapting and how their food systems are meeting challenges will affect Canadian producers. Going forward, I think, again, value-added processing really has a lot of potential for possibly creating more domestic markets and more stability for our producers and adding that value here in Canada. But of course, then we also need to rely on our federal government to be a strong voice, keeping borders open, accessing new market potential, resolving geopolitical disputes. And, we need to keep borders open. Canada, with our population for the long term, will remain very export dependent, whether that's on raw commodities or finished goods. But we need to try and stabilize our primary producers here. And I think that not only should we be seeking other opportunities in terms of market potential to try and stabilize some of those markets. Of course, there's always going to be geopolitical disputes between countries, but having new market access, I think, will provide some stability. In terms of programming, as I said, I think that there needs to be reform in our business risk management programs so that when, another crisis emerges, that we're better supporting our producers.
I have another question that actually just segues right perfectly into what you were discussing. So this question is, one of our challenges in Canadian agriculture is just dependence on export markets that can close doors very quickly. Primary agriculture cannot react quickly to such changes because of the nature of growing cycles. We speak of diversifying markets, but still rely on 3 or 4 key partners. So what opportunities are we missing?
Well, there's definitely a lot of potential in terms of Asian markets right now. I think the EU will remain, somewhat of a potential for Canada to expand on those markets. But then, of course, we need to look at the types of policies that they're implementing. For example, in the European Union, they have stricter environmental and animal welfare policies. And if Canadian producers want to trade into those markets, we need to basically be adapting to some of those international policies as well. I think there is definitely different markets in the world, especially right now, that we see, certain countries, especially in Asia, that are concerned about their food system and want to access new markets and ensure more stability of their agriculture supply. And like I mentioned in the presentation, that's what a lot of researchers are saying right now, is that this soft power that Canada has by being able to produce such a stable and high quality ag commodity in various sectors, has the ability to create those new markets and also possibly resolve some of the geopolitical disputes that we have so far that are putting those barriers on our Canadian products. But like I said, I think going forward, Canada is always going to be very export dependent, whether that means raw commodities or finished goods. We need to rely on those international markets. But again, a lot of it has to do with politics.
Yeah. And I know that some people, some of my friends and some people that were reading my stories at the beginning of the pandemic were really worried that we would be run out of flour here. And I was like, we will not. We have so much wheat that we're exporting. We are a wheat exporting country. We're not going to. And we actually ended up doing a story about that too. So one of the other questions I have is, the paper is a lot about short-term relief efforts here. So what are the longer term consequences of not giving more support?
Well, I think that, like as I mentioned in the paper, yes, we need to be reactive right now in terms of the pandemic, helping our primary producers and our processors weather the storm of this crisis. But we need to have this longer term vision of what we want agriculture to be, and then back it up with supports and action steps. And I think that we need to better support our farmers, but also look again at the ag food system as really this holistic, approach, because there's so many different facets of it that are interconnected and support each other. But, one of the questions earlier was, it seems that Canadian farmers are constantly in survival mode, and that's very true. And we need to figure out better ways of trying to improve the resiliency of our food system. And I think while our food system is held up really well, there's definitely vulnerabilities to it. And that, those lessons that we can draw from this pandemic, offer the ability for us to create this dialogue on how do we make our food system more resilient going forward? Because, we're going to face more crisis in the future, possibility of a pandemic. And it would be nice to see some of our policymakers really take a proactive approach instead of always trying to react to the latest crisis.
So we have a question here. It seems that we often hear complaints about the demise of the family farm, with these smaller operations replaced by large corporate operations. To what extent is this trend actually happening, and should we be concerned about it? Don't larger operations have the potential to supply food more cost effectively?
Well, definitely it's been a trend of declining number of farms and farmers in Canada for years. We have an aging farm population. The bulk of Canadian farmers are over 55. And if we look at those demographics, they also reflect the modern technology that Canadian agriculture has put on their farms. So we're able to produce more with less farm workers. And I think that, that's also got a lot of farms into financial struggle because the input costs have continued to increase. And farmers, in order to remain viable, have had to incur huge amounts of debt. And so, we see these trends of declining number of farmers, but input costs are increasing and net revenues are declining. And if you look at some of these trends, I think it's only probably going to continue. Farms are getting larger and larger. If you look at StatsCan, they say that, the average farm in Canada, depending on province, for instance, in Saskatchewan, 1,200 acres. Well, the reality is that most grain and oilseed farms nowadays, are tens of thousands of acres. That's a trend that I think will definitely continue. It's hard to attract younger people into primary sectors. And if there isn't that transition, usually from parents to children, then I can't see many, urban kids being able to, start a grain and oilseed farm on the prairies. The costs are huge. And so in terms of that trend, I definitely see it continuing, that farm numbers will continue to decline. But we need to look at the farmers that are still operating. We need to look at what better ways that we can support them or support that transition if their children are interested in farming. How do we facilitate an easier process of trying to transition it from one generation to another?
I think too, like what I found too as well, just in my personal experience, is that family farms become incorporated as corporations, and then so people sometimes get confused because it's incorporated as a company, but it's still run by a family. And I feel like that's one area where people who aren't in agriculture sometimes get a little confused when they see a farm that is operating as a corporation.
And most small farms nowadays are incorporated. They're small businesses. And
Yeah.
I think there's a huge misconception, amongst urban consumers, especially, that have that disconnect from rural Canada and especially farming communities, that, they have this idea of what they want farming to look like. Whether it's a farm that's got, chickens and cows and every which animal and producing small commodities and plots. And the reality is very different. And Canadian farmers have shown, that they're smart business owners, but of course they're at the mercy of a lot of factors beyond their control.
So one person has a question. The price of food seems to increase since the pandemic. Is this the case?
Apparently not. So at the University of Dalhousie, there's researchers there that come out with a food price report every year. So in December of 2019, they projected that for 2020, food prices would range an increase between 4 and 6%. And those numbers were recently updated because those researchers at Dalhousie were looking at, okay, what is the reality of this pandemic and how has food prices actually increased? So with the exception of a few maybe food products such as rice, which we depend on importing those from only 4 countries in the world, there have been very minimal increases. And so it has stayed at 4 to 6% as projected, meat being slightly higher, so at that 6%. Again, like I said in the presentation, that's not to say that food prices won't continue to increase. And that, of course, depends a lot on our domestic retail and food processing facilities, but also what's going on globally.
Yeah. So this question is somewhat related to that last question, actually. Is Canada's food industry been so successful too successful so far in handling the pandemic that the public might forget about its vulnerabilities? Because, some of our earlier crises are passing, we're moving on. Is there a chance that the public could just forget?
Absolutely. It's hard to sustain public attention because our food system has shown its resiliency. And when consumers stopped panic buying and hoarding products, for instance, they saw that, the grocery store shelves were remaining supplied. And so that initial panic and uncertainty of accessing food, I think, has subsided. And with that, public attention has as well. I mean, just doing a quick search on the Edmonton Journal in the last couple of days and some of the other urban media across Canada, the only stories that I have found about agriculture and food supply have been announcing that farmers markets are now open. So unfortunately, a crisis will kind of provoke this spike in public attention, but we need to really figure out how do we sustain that. And I think a lot of consumers that are interested in the food system, where their food is coming from, they will still be interested, but in order to try and generate that sustained public widespread attention, I would like to see more, articles being put forth from farm media into urban newspapers. I think that would be helpful. I mean, throughout this pandemic, the farm media has done such an excellent job of trying to inform Canadians. But of course, most Canadians might not, pick up the Western producer or the cooperator. And I think that going forward, we really need to stress to Canadians that your food system is something that you depend on a daily basis. It affects the quality of your life. The agriculture industry affects you economically, socially, environmentally, and it's something worth paying attention to. But, going forward, we need to try and sustain that public attention The farm groups really need to try and push that attention onto the policy agenda of government so that policy change, meaningful policy change, can really occur.
So I'm just going to ask another this will be our last question. Unfortunately, we have tons of questions, but we don't have any more time. So I'm just going to ask, I think we'll end on something uplifting here. So what are the real strengths of the agricultural industry? Because like years ago, the federal government pointed out in the Barton report that the Canadian agricultural industry had the ability to kickstart the economy and be a big growth driver. So yeah, let's talk about some of the positives that we have here to just kind of, finish off this session.
Well, I think this crisis has really shown the resiliency of our food system. And it's shown how, as an essential service, agriculture and farmers have continued to operate while many sectors of our economy have been completely shut down. And with that mindset, we need to understand that Canadian agriculture has really been the backbone of our economy, especially when we look at, certain provinces. It's definitely more a part of our economy. Local economies are so dependent on the health of our agricultural industry. Definitely as a whole, I think our commodities that we're producing, are the highest quality of commodities in the world. Canada is known for its safe and quality commodities and our processed goods. We need to build on the Canada brand. I think that's a very important part of any government policy going forward internationally. We need to keep promoting our Canada brand. But with that being said, there's definitely a lot of strengths, but there's also been some vulnerabilities to our food system that we've identified through this pandemic. And we need to look at how we can maybe more effectively, try and mitigate those risks going forward. There's that old saying that don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so we need to look at what we have, what our strengths are, but also identify some of those vulnerabilities and try and mitigate those risks.
So you have some closing remarks, Dr. Holland. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I know I've learned a lot. The next webinar is going to be on June 18th with Guillaume Lermy. He'll be talking about the system approach for efficient policy lessons learned from antimicrobial resistance and health management. And I think the time that one will be at 11 o'clock on June 18th. So yes, Dr. Holland, thank you so much, and would love to hear your closing remarks.
Well, thanks again for everyone joining today. I greatly appreciate it. The interest in this policy topic is something near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate the interest, and I've been receiving emails the last few days from many of the people that have been registered, and I appreciate your interest and your support. I think just in closing, I think that, one of the silver linings of this pandemic has really been to shed light on how important agriculture is to our nation. Going forward, I think that agriculture needs to be recognized for the multiple economic, social, and environmental roles that it plays for our nation. It's an essential service that should not be taken for granted. In the short term, we need to be reactive, help our ag industry through this crisis, but we need to have a long-term vision. We need to step up with some action steps and support our farmers, our processing, our packaging, the ag industry as a whole. We need to support it going forward to maximize the unlimited potential that it does have. And with that, I'll end. Thank you, Alexis, for moderating.
Oh, thank you. And everyone, thanks for attending again. And please keep an eye on your email for a follow-up survey and link to the recording. Have a great day.